Andy Williams stopped his show when a 9-year-old leukemia patient asked Keith Richards one question: "Can you teach me to play before I die?" Keith looked at the $50,000 vintage guitar in his hands, the same one his grandfather gave him, and did something no one expected. He placed it in the boy's lap and said, "This isn't mine anymore. It's yours, forever." Andy Williams tried to stop him. "Keith, you can't." Keith cut him off. "I just did." The boy died 72 hours later, still holding that guitar. What happened at his funeral made Keith break down on live TV a week later. It was March 1974, and Keith Richards was scheduled to appear on The Andy Williams Show. Keith arrived at the NBC studios carrying his most prized possession, the 1953 Telecaster his grandfather Theodore had given him the day before dying. The same battered guitar Johnny Carson had mocked on The Tonight Show months earlier, calling it a piece of garbage. Keith never traveled without it. To him, it wasn't just an instrument. It was his grandfather's legacy, his connection to the man who taught him that music could save lives. 15 minutes before the show was set to tape, a production assistant approached Andy Williams in his dressing room. "Mr. Williams, we have a situation. There's a family in the third row audience. Their son is 9 years old and has terminal leukemia. The doctors have given him maybe a week to live. His dying wish was to see Keith Richards perform. The family managed to get tickets, and they're wondering if there's any way their son could meet Keith, even just briefly during a commercial break." Andy Williams was known for running a family-friendly show, but he wasn't heartless. "Where are they sitting?" The assistant pointed toward the studio. Andy could see the small boy through the monitor, painfully thin, wearing a baseball cap to cover his bald head from chemotherapy, an oversized Rolling Stones t-shirt hanging off his frail frame. "Tell them we'll arrange something during the break. Keith can shake his hand, take a quick photo." But when the assistant relayed the request to Keith, he had a different response. "No," Keith said firmly. The assistant looked surprised. "I'm sorry, Mr. Richards. I understand if you're not comfortable." Keith cut him off. "You don't understand. I'm not doing some 30-second handshake during a commercial break like the kid's an afterthought. If he came here to see me, if this is his dying wish, then he deserves better than that. Bring him on stage, during my segment, on camera." The assistant looked uncertain. "I'll have to clear that with Mr. Williams." Keith's expression was hard. "Then clear it, because I'm not treating a dying child like a publicity stunt. We do this right or we don't do it at all." When Andy heard about Keith's insistence, he hesitated. "Keith, this is a family show. I'm not sure putting a terminally ill child on television is appropriate for our audience." Keith looked at Andy with something close to anger. "What's inappropriate is pretending he doesn't exist. What's inappropriate is making him feel like he's too sick to be seen. If he's strong enough to come here, he's strong enough to be on this stage, and I'm going to make sure he gets more than a handshake from some rock star who couldn't be bothered to actually see him." Andy realized Keith wasn't going to budge. "All right, but we do this tastefully, and if the parents aren't comfortable, the parents will be grateful. Trust me." The show went live in front of 30 million viewers. Andy did his opening monologue, introduced some guests, and then brought out Keith Richards. They went through the standard interview, questions about the new Rolling Stones album, stories from the road, the usual talk show banter. Keith played along, giving the expected answers, but there was a tension in his demeanor that Andy couldn't quite read. Then, about 15 minutes into the segment, Keith did something Andy hadn't approved. He stopped mid-sentence, turned away from Andy, and looked directly at the camera. "Before I play a song, there's something I need to do. There's someone in the audience tonight who came specifically to see me, and I think he should come up here." Andy's face went pale. This wasn't in the script. The audience murmured in confusion. Keith gestured toward the third row. "Come on up, mate. Don't be shy." The boy's mother gasped. His father helped the child stand, and slowly, carefully, 9-year-old Tommy Sullivan made his way toward the stage. The audience watched in complete silence as this tiny, obviously sick child walked down the aisle. Keith met him at the stairs, kneeling down so he was at Tommy's eye level. The cameras captured everything. Keith's weathered, lived-in face next to Tommy's pale, fragile one, the rock and roll legend and the dying child. Keith held out his hand, and Tommy shook it with a grip that was heartbreakingly weak. "What's your name?" Keith asked gently. "Tommy," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tommy Sullivan." Keith smiled. "Good to meet you, Tommy. Come sit with me." He guided Tommy to the center of the stage, where the crew had quickly set up 2 chairs. Tommy sat down carefully, like every movement required thought and effort. Keith sat beside him, still holding the guitar. "Tommy, why did you want to come see me tonight?" Keith asked. Tommy looked at his parents in the audience, then back at Keith. His voice was quiet but clear. "Because I want to learn to play guitar, like you. But the doctors say I don't have much time left, maybe a week, so I won't get to learn. But I wanted to meet you anyway, to tell you that your music makes me happy. Even when I'm sick and scared and everything hurts, your music makes it better." The studio was absolutely silent. Keith sat very still, and those watching could see his jaw working as he fought to control his emotions. He looked down at the guitar in his hands, his grandfather's guitar, the guitar that had been with him through everything, the most precious thing he owned, and he made a decision that would change both their lives. Keith placed the guitar in Tommy's small lap. Tommy looked confused. "What are you doing?" Keith's voice was thick with emotion. "This guitar belonged to my grandfather. He gave it to me the day before he died. I've carried it with me for 20 years. It's the most important thing I own." He paused, tears visible in his eyes. "And I'm giving it to you, right here, right now. It's yours, Tommy, forever." The studio erupted in gasps. Andy Williams stood up from his desk. "Keith, you can't—" Keith didn't even look at him. "I just did." Andy tried again, aware that millions were watching. "Keith, that guitar is worth a fortune. You can't just give it away to—" Keith turned to face Andy, and his expression stopped Andy mid-sentence. "To what, Andy? To a dying child? Why can't I? It's my guitar, and Tommy needs it more than I do." Keith turned back to Tommy, whose eyes were wide with disbelief. "Tommy, you said you wanted to learn to play. You've got a week. That's not much time, but it's enough to learn 1 song. Do you want me to teach you? Right here? Right now?" Tommy's voice was barely audible. "You'd really teach me?" "What song do you want to learn?" Keith asked. Tommy thought for just a moment. "Love Me Tender. It's my mom's favorite, and mine too." Keith felt something break inside his chest. "That's a perfect choice. That was the first song my grandfather taught me on this very guitar, and now I'm going to teach it to you." For the next 15 minutes, in front of 30 million viewers, Keith Richards taught a dying 9-year-old boy how to play guitar. He positioned Tommy's small, thin fingers on the frets, showing him gently where to press, how to hold the pick, how to strum. "Don't worry about making it perfect. Music isn't about perfection. It's about feeling. Just feel it, Tommy." Tommy's fingers fumbled at first. His hands were weak from illness, and the guitar was heavy for someone so frail. But Keith was endless patient. "That's it. You've got it. Now the next chord." Slowly, painfully slowly, Tommy began to understand. The notes became clearer, the transitions smoother, and then, miraculously, Tommy played through an entire verse without a mistake. The studio audience erupted in applause, but it wasn't the usual entertainment applause. It was something deeper, gratitude, admiration, the sound of people witnessing something sacred. Tommy looked up at Keith with pure joy radiating from his thin face. "I did it!" Keith nodded, tears streaming openly down his face now. "You did, mate. You're a guitarist now, a real one."
Keith looked out at Tommy's parents, both of whom were crying. "Take him home. Let him practice. This guitar belongs to him now, and I want him to play it every day he has left, however many days that is. He should spend them making music." Tommy held the guitar carefully, like it was made of glass, like it was the most precious thing in the world, which to him it was. As Tommy's parents helped him off the stage, Tommy turned back one more time. "Keith?" "Yeah, mate?" "Thank you. For the guitar. For the lesson. For seeing me." Keith's voice broke completely. "Thank you, Tommy, for reminding me why any of this matters." After the show, Keith sat alone in his dressing room for a long time, looking at his empty hands. He'd carried that guitar for 2 decades. It had been with him through every triumph and disaster, and now it was gone. But instead of regret, he felt something else. Peace. 3 days later, at 2 a.m. in a hotel room in Chicago, Keith's phone rang. It was Tommy's mother. Her voice was gentle but sad. "Keith, I wanted you to know, Tommy passed away about an hour ago, peacefully in his sleep. He didn't suffer." Keith sat up in bed. "I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry," she said. "He was so happy these last 3 days. He practiced that song every day. He got so good at it, Keith, really good. And when he got too weak to play anymore, he just held the guitar. He died holding it. His hands were on the strings." Keith couldn't speak for a moment. When he did, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm glad he wasn't alone. I'm glad he had the guitar." "He had more than that," Tommy's mother said. "He had hope. He had joy. He had purpose. You gave him that. In his final days, when most dying children are just waiting, Tommy was creating. Thank you, Keith. Thank you for seeing him." The funeral was that Wednesday in a small town in Ohio. Keith cancelled 3 concerts to be there. He sat with Tommy's family in the small church, dressed simply, trying not to draw attention. The guitar was in the casket with Tommy, positioned so the boy's small hands rested on the strings, and tucked between the strings was a folded piece of paper. Tommy's mother saw Keith looking at it. "He wrote you a note the day before he died. He wanted it to stay with the guitar, but he wanted you to read it first." With trembling hands, Keith carefully removed the note and unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky, childish, clearly written by someone very sick. "Dear Keith, thank you for teaching me. I practiced every day like you said. I can play the song now, all the way through without mistakes. Mum says I got really good. I wish I had more time to learn more songs from you, but I'm grateful for the time I had. I'll play Love Me Tender in heaven and think of you. Your friend, Tommy Sullivan. P.S. Take care of yourself. The world needs your music." Keith carefully folded the note and put it in his pocket. When the service ended and people were invited to speak, Keith stood. "I knew Tommy for 15 minutes, he said to the small gathering. But in those 15 minutes, he taught me more about courage and grace than I've learned in 40 years of living. Tommy reminded me that music isn't about fame or money or sold-out stadiums. It's about connection. It's about making someone's life better, even if just for a moment. Tommy spent his last 3 days making music on my grandfather's guitar, and that guitar will never mean more to me than it does knowing it brought him joy." The next week, Keith returned to the Andy Williams Show for a previously scheduled appearance. Andy opened the show by addressing what had happened. "Last week, our guest Keith Richards did something extraordinary. He gave his most prized possession to a young fan named Tommy Sullivan, who was terminally ill. Tommy passed away 3 days later. Keith is here tonight, and I know many of you are wondering, Keith, do you regret giving away that guitar?" Keith walked out to a standing ovation.
He sat down across from Andy and pulled Tommy's note from his pocket. "Tommy wrote me a letter before he died. Can I read it?" Andy nodded. Keith tried to read it aloud. He got through, "Dear Keith, thank you for teaching me," before his voice cracked. He paused, composed himself, and tried again. "I practiced every day like you said." He had to stop again. The third attempt, he made it to, "I can play the song now," before the grief overcame him completely. Keith Richards sat on national television in front of 30 million people and broke down. Not quiet, dignified crying, but deep, shaking sobs. He tried to apologize, tried to pull himself together, but he couldn't. Andy Williams did something unprecedented. He got up from his desk, walked over, and sat beside Keith. He put a hand on Keith's shoulder and just stayed there, silent, supportive, letting Keith grieve. The cameras kept rolling. 30 million people watched Keith Richards, the hardest man in rock and roll, completely vulnerable. When Keith finally regained some composure, his voice was raw. "Do I regret it? No, never. That guitar gave Tommy joy when he had every reason to despair. My grandfather gave me that guitar so I could make music that mattered, and I did exactly that. I have no regrets." The episode became one of the most watched variety shows in television history. The footage has been viewed hundreds of millions of times and is used in music therapy programs around the world. Keith never replaced that guitar. When asked why, he always says the same thing: that guitar is exactly where it should be. Tommy's parents donated the guitar to a children's hospital, where it sits in a display case with Tommy's photo and his letter to Keith. Thousands of children battling cancer have stood before that case, read that story, and found strength. The plaque beneath reads, "Keith Richards taught Tommy Sullivan to play guitar. Tommy Sullivan taught Keith Richards what really matters." March 1974. If this story of sacrifice and the true meaning of generosity moved you, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to remember that the most valuable things we own are only valuable when they bring joy to others. Have you ever given something precious to help someone else? Share your story in the comments.